Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures today for our webinar, Political Digital Ads, Disclosure, Free Speech, and Legislation. My name is Mandy Sock. I'm a policy specialist in NCSL's Elections and Redistricting program, and I'll be your moderator today. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. So over the next 60 minutes, I encourage you to participate by using the chat box, which you'll see in your lower left-hand corner. Feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in that chat box on your screen. We will have a formal Q&A after our presenters have finished, but you can share your questions with us as they come to you. To test it out and learn who has joined us today, I invite all of the attendees to go ahead and type in your state and name now. Underneath the chat box, you will see a resources button. That's where you can find and download a PDF version of today's PowerPoint presentation. Above that presentation screen, there's a tab labeled Speaker where you can read the bios of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. This webinar platform is optimized for use in Google Chrome. While other web browsers such as Firefox may work, we recommend anyone experiencing technical difficulties try signing in through Chrome instead. If you continue to experience technical issues, please email registration@ncsl.org, where our team is ready to assist you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. To learn about the current state of digital campaign ads. Our three speakers will offer different perspectives on transparency, free speech, and regulation in digital political advertising. Our presenters today are Ronald Jacobs, David Vorman, and Jared Demarinis. Ron will be our first speaker. He is currently counsel to the Digital Advertising Alliance, and he has founded and currently co-chairs Venable's nationally recognized political law practice. He advises clients on all aspects of state and federal political law, including advertising regulations for campaigns and organizations, campaign finance, lobbying disclosure, gifts and ethics rules, and pay-to-play laws. Ron, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is now yours.
Great, thanks, Mandy, and thanks everyone else for being here today. So I will kick it off and kind of talk a little bit about the industry view when it comes to digital political ads. And I think one of the interesting things is if you think about other kinds of legislation where you say we're going to regulate XYZ industry, that maybe there's a pretty simple picture of what that means to be the industry. And when you're talking about digital political ads, there's a lot of different parts to the industry. And so I think it's helpful to frame the discussion or to think about the discussion in terms of who all is covered by different laws that may affect digital political advertisers. And it kind of runs through the whole list from the obvious, the candidates, the PACs, the nonprofits like the 501c4s or the 501c6 trade associations that might be involved in the process, but it also affects political consultants, particularly digital strategists, and the digital advertising firms, the publishers, so that the websites, the platforms that you may go and visit where the digital ads may appear. But then there's also this whole world in between that I'll talk a little bit about and help to hopefully explain a little bit of the exchanges, the various demand side platforms and supply side platforms that help to get those digital ads from the campaign or the consultant to the users who are watching the ads or who see the ads when they're delivered. So that's a whole bunch of different people, obviously, from the candidates all the way through high-tech companies and a lot of companies in between that kind of the general public may not even know exist to get those ads there. So bringing you this perspective is outside counsel to the Digital Advertising Alliance on political law issues. And just to give you a sense of who the DAA is, it's a group that's made up of a variety of different advertising-based trade associations. You can see their logos there. And it's designed not as a trade association itself, but as a group that helps to bring different elements of self-regulation to the table. One of the things that the DAA created a number of years ago was an opt-out or a control mechanism for certain privacy preferences. And you may be familiar with one of the DAA's products, it's a little triangle with an eye in the center of it that shows up on a lot of different advertisements. So if you happen to see an ad that pops up on your local newspaper website, and there's a little light blue triangle with an eye in it, you can click on that and control some of your privacy settings as it goes across different ad platforms. So that's what they've done before. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, the DAA has also taken first steps toward self-regulation in the political advertising space, and is working toward helping to solve at least some parts of the digital ad ecosystem and how best to make the experience a good one for people. So the digital system, the phrase I've used a couple of times here, and that is that a political ad or any other kind of ad that is served up in the digital space will appear either in a social media feed, in a paid post on a website, in an app if you're on your phone or your tablet, in a whole variety of different places. Advertisements can pop up. And so the first thing I want to talk about, because I think it really affects how you think about regulating political advertising, if at all, is to kind of understand the number of different steps and how it's much different than, say, taking out an ad in a hard copy newspaper where the campaign would basically call up the newspaper's advertising offices and say, hey, I want to take out an ad, how big, quarter page, and then you send your art in and make the payment and it runs. Or if you're doing TV advertising, you have a media buyer who contacts the TV station, they ship the ad to them and they make the payment and it runs on a certain schedule. And there are very few intermediaries involved in that process. The newspaper knows exactly who's advertising on its hard copy pages, and every subscriber is going to get the same ads on that printed newspaper. Likewise, TV stations, they know who's advertising. They're responsible for the content in various ways under different federal laws. And so they know exactly who's there. They can keep a file on it in a relatively simple way. The digital ecosystem is much different. And so I've got a couple of graphics here to try and explain this a little bit. Now, having the lawyer try and explain technical systems is never a good idea, but we're going to give it a try today. So this first slide is an overview of the digital advertising ecosystem, and I've designed it to show particularly campaign-focused advertising. Typically, if someone were presenting this to others outside the political space, they would have on that left side where I have the candidates, they would have brands, so big national advertisers or even local advertisers would be there. But so in the political world, we have our candidates, our PACs, our super PACs, our nonprofits, whoever it may be who's airing political advertising here. When I use the word political advertising, it's a little tricky because there are a lot of different definitions. Under some state campaign finance laws, you have things like express advocacy, where you say vote for or vote against. There are things in other state law where electioneering communications, where it's a reference to a candidate within a certain period of time before an election. And then some of the platforms out there, like particularly some of the big social media platforms, have taken an even broader construct of what it means to be a digital advertiser or digital political ad, and have said if it's something that affects even public policy. If you try and place an ad to talk about an issue of the day on a platform like Facebook, they will say that that's a political ad and impose their own requirements on that advertising. So you've got your advertisers on the left side, you've got your voters on the right side. They're the ones who are going to consume the content that the publishers publish. So publishers means website owners, newspapers that are shown online, all the different kinds of content providers. And I use this graphic to kind of show everything from a phone to a laptop. Even your watch now can be a source of advertising, as much as your set-top box, because if you're watching video over one of the online services, it's not broadcast or cable, it comes through the internet. You can place ads there, a typical computer. So a whole bunch of different ways that the publishers display both their content and then also the advertising that helps fund that content. So now we've kind of got the left side and the right side here. I want to kind of work our way through. So going over on the left side, you've got your agencies. So these could be your a digital consultant that might be working for a candidate. It could be the campaign manager, a whole variety of different things where you start to develop that digital content. The next sort of, toward the center, there's the DSPs and the SSPs on the two sides there. Those are kind of the green, my little cloud-based icons. The demand side platforms and the supply side platforms. So when we go through the example of how an ad actually gets served, you'll see that the demand side platforms are companies that are out there looking for places to place ads, whereas the supply side platforms are companies out there who are the ones who want to place, who have the location of the ad that they want to place, and they're looking for ads to fill their sites with. And in between are these racks and racks of servers, the ad networks and ad exchanges, which can be everything from a very full service, very careful thing where you may actually see, I want my ad on this particular publisher's website in a very concrete way, or it may be a bidding platform where you're literally bidding for ad space in real time in filling and serving those ads based on different criteria that you create. So that's in the abstract in how this works. And so now I want to look at kind of a specific example. And sometimes this surprises people, others are familiar with it. But basically the idea here is that you have a voter kind of over there on the right side of the screen looking at a newspaper site, whatever the newspaper may be, the local news. And as they navigate to that website, there's an ad space there. So that green box there, an empty ad platform or container basically where an ad's going to be served. And the way this works is so that person navigates to the website, and of course the website knows certain things about that user through cookies and other kinds of sort of analytic tools that exist. And so that website sends a request to the supply side publisher saying, hey, I've got this ad space. It's of this particular size, and here's the kind of user that I've got there who's watching it. And then that request gets sent to the exchange, which then lets the demand side publisher know, hey, I've got this ad that's available. Here's how much it costs. The demand side publisher has on its site or in its technology both the content of the ad and then also kind of the features that the advertiser wants, right? How much they're willing to pay, what audience they're looking for, the type of publisher that they're looking for, all kinds of different information where they've said this is who we want to see our ad. So then it sends that information back to the exchange, and once you find sort of the right price, the right demographics, the right user, it then sends that back to the supply side publisher, which then sends it back to the website, and there you get the candidate's ad showing up on your screen. Now what's remarkable is that this all happens in the blink of an eye. In the time that user surfed to the newspaper website, that all happens in the background, and in that brief delay before the ad shows up, all of that may have happened. So it's a very fast process. And what I'd like to point out here when you're thinking about regulating digital political ads, what's so complicated or makes things tricky is that you're really looking at all these different parts of the ecosystem that you may seek to impose regulation on that can cause problems or can at least be more difficult than your typical advertising scenario. So what I wanted to kind of frame up here is sort of some what I call regulatory questions. These are some things that regulators sometimes want to get to the bottom of. Now, again, it's not to say these are necessarily all of the right questions or that these are the right questions to ask or that these are questions that should be asked. But what I've heard from others is these are the kinds of things when they're trying to think about how do we want to regulate the digital political advertising space that they often will look to. So who's placing the ad? Is it a candidate or a third party? How was the ad targeted? What were the demographics used to select that person? How much was paid? How many people saw the ad after the fact? That's an interesting question because if you think about it, back to the slide before, you could have an advertiser that wants to run an ad and, maybe they bid too low on the price. Maybe they don't have the right set of demographics, and so very few people could see the ad. or maybe a lot of people did. It's going to vary over time depending on exactly how the whole thing is programmed in. Which different ads were shown? So, my example before, there's an ad that shows up when that particular user surfs to the newspaper site. Unlike a print newspaper, if my wife surfs to that site, she may get a different ad than I do. Maybe it's for the same candidate, but it's touting two different policy positions based on the different demographic information that the cookies and other information is available, so that it serves up different versions, different ads, different versions of ads, all kinds of different things can be served up. So some people want to know, well, how many different kinds of ads were there? What do the different ads look like? Who funded the ad is another question. It's a little different than who placed it. Are we talking about contributor information at that point in time? All different things that have come up in different aspects of sort of regulating political ads. So with those questions in mind, one of the ways to solve for some of this or deal with it are what I call the disclaimer issues. And many of you are probably familiar. Most states have some kind of requirement for a political ad, whether that be express advocacy or an electioneering communication, that requires a paid for by line on the face of the ad, paid for by Joe Blow for state representative or whatever it may be. Other states have additional requirements depending on the kind of political actor it is. Independent Expenditure Committee may have to disclose its top 5 contributors in certain states. And of course, it's one thing to do this in a television ad. It's another to do it in a print ad or in a mailer. It's another to say what that's going to look like if it's a digital ad that gets served on my phone, which is a much different screen size than my computer monitor. And so how that appears may be a problem, and it may be something that is tricky for legislation to solve. So this is where my client, the Digital Advertising Alliance, comes into things, and they said a couple years ago, as there were a lot of concerns about digital ads, particularly with the Russian interference after the 2016 election, how can we help solve at least the disclaimer part of the problem when you have ads that are going to be wildly different sizes? And so what they came up with was this idea of the political ads icon. So it's a purple circle or purple triangle with the I for information in there. And the idea is that political advertisers can use this to solve or to provide some of the information that you would have for the in a typical disclaimer. The idea being that this self-regulatory regime is required of advertisers who are part of the Digital Advertising Alliance, part of the different trade associations that make up the DAA, but that certainly others would use it over time, and that it could be used by states as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the idea of the political ad icon is that it identifies the ad as a political ad. It provides a simple way to let users obtain more information about that ad by clicking on that icon or even hovering over it. It pulls up what's called an interstitial that brings more information to it. And so what it's designed for is to provide a minimum amount of information that the DAA established through SelfReg protocols, but allows more information to be displayed as well. So the SelfReg aspect, the idea here is they can help a state as well. If a state has disclaimer requirements, and if it were to adopt something similar to the DAA icon or allow for iconography, as some states have done, with the DAA out there with its SelfReg program, which helps to bring accountability, it allows for consumer complaints, it monitors political ads through electronic searching technology so that it too can find ads that are non-conforming, because the DAA wants advertisers to use the DAA tools in order to provide a better experience for users. So with that in mind, it can sort of buttress the ability of a state to look for things and bring additional compliance. So how does it work? So the idea would be if you have a political ad that's served, the icon appears, here you can see it in the little gray box there at the top. You click on that, and that brings up this interstitial that has additional information in it about who paid for the ad, what's required. Let me pull up the next slide. So the name of the advertiser, a little bit of contact information, which is again similar to what a lot of states require, and certainly very similar to what the federal standard is for federal ads. Other information is required by applicable federal or state law. So again, the idea here is that it can be flexible. If the state says you can use an icon, you can populate that icon with the information that's needed. And the idea here is that all of the information that's provided is provided by the advertiser. So this is just a series of screens where an ad platform has set this up, that if you're someone who's buying ads for a political candidate or political party, you go through these different windows where you say, yes, it's a political ad, input the information, and then you fill in what will appear on that interstitial. And the idea here is that this is not a platform-side self-regulatory measure, but an advertiser self-regulatory measure, because it's the advertiser who knows what ads they're serving, what ads are political ads, and should have the icon on them, because as you saw through that diagram of the complicated chain, it's harder to know, on the platform side, who's advertising on the platform. As I said, the idea here is that the DAA icon is a self-regulatory program, but it can work with state laws. And governments can include an icon option for disclaimers, whether they be on ads that are too small or any digital political ad. You can specify in your law what the interstitial pop-up will say. You can even reference, whether it's in the law or in the regulations, that the DAA standard will work to satisfy a state law. And our view from the DAA is that it's easier to say use this kind of an icon or allow for the DAA icon than trying to come up with font size requirements or colors, particularly when you're dealing not with an 8.5 by 11 mailer, but with a whole bunch of different sizes of ads that can get very small at times. And so the idea would be that either you include the icon ideally instead of the disclaimer, because people will learn kind of how the icon works and bring up more information and make it much easier than trying to stick a whole bunch of text on an ad that may be very small. So the one thing that the icon does not do, it does not provide, it does not require the platforms to maintain information. It's one area where we've seen some states, and I'm sure Jared will talk a little bit about Maryland's efforts at regulation in this way. It does not require the platforms to maintain information about the advertiser. It does not impose disclosure beyond what's generally required by the state law, and it does not create any kind of an ad database. So it doesn't solve that question that I flagged before of sort of what are all the different ads that this advertiser has displayed? What are the different demographics? It doesn't keep that information. It's simply designed to effectuate those disclaimer requirements in state law. So that's my kind of whirlwind tour of sort of how the digital ecosystem works, how the DAA has hopefully solved at least one problem, and that perhaps states can work with the DAA to try and solve that problem under their state laws, instead of reinventing the wheel. And now I will turn it over to my other presenters.
Thank you so much, Ron. I have to say your slide, especially the one with the arrows and animations, that is just immensely clarifying. So thank you for that. Next up, we have David Vorman, who is a senior policy analyst for free expression with Americans for Prosperity. Most recently, he served as legislative counsel in the Office of Representative Virginia Fox. David began his career in the White House Office of Records Management, serving under the Bush and Obama administrations. In 2010, he left D.C. to attend law school at the University of Nebraska College of Law, where he focused on civil litigation and constitutional law. He practiced civil litigation in Nebraska before moving back to D.C. to work for Congress. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Mandy. As Mandy explained, I'm a senior policy analyst, and I focus on free expression and free speech. So that's going to be really the key to how I view digital political ads. The disclosure and the legislation is through the lens of free speech. First, I think it's important when we talk about political ads, when you say political ads, it brings to mind a lot of things for a lot of people. But what's important, I think, specifically as legislators, is to remember that political ads are core political speech. And when you regulate political ads, you're regulating speech. That speech, the political speech, has been recognized by the Supreme Court and courts all across the country as really being at the heart of the First Amendment protections, protecting people's ability to speak about government, to speak to politics, which is all implicated in political ads when we talk about regulating political ads. Also, we've seen that free speech is the best defense against bad government, and efforts to curb speech and political ads will inevitably hurt those that the policies claim to protect. A lot of times we see that political ads are important for non-incumbents. The government can regulate, and when it's government regulating free speech about government, there's an inherent conflict of interest. So I think it's important to protect political ads and to protect the ability of people to reform government. Also, I think when we talk about digital ads and the internet, we've seen that the low expense and the broad access to the internet makes them effective for newcomers, for people with not a lot of money, for not a lot of sophisticated organizations to organize and to make their voices heard. I don't think that a lot of groups that are newly arising have the ability, the means to get an ad on TV, whether that's expense or just the TV is a limited area. On the other hand, the internet is accessible to a lot of people on their phones, as Ron said, on their watches. Look at something like Twitter, where even in the Middle East, you saw with all of the revolutions, the people were able to get their voices out. I think that's important when we look at honest ads type policies that really seek to change the internet and regulate it like traditional media, like newspaper or TV ads. And that makes it more burdensome for social media sites, for new organizations that pop up, and for citizens to get out and get their voices heard. You think about a group like Black Lives Matter or the Parkland students that came up. Those were students that arguing about gun control, which is an important issue, and they want to make political ads maybe about gun control, and they may not have the sophistication or the means to get their message out through advertisement in a newspaper or TV, but the low expense of the internet allows them to get their voices out and to get their voices heard. So viewing political ads as core political speech, as speech that is at the heart of the First Amendment protections, that raises concerns with some of the regulations and legislation that seek to regulate political ads and political speech. The first problem is the chilling of speech. Burdensome regulations chill political speech, and it does so in two ways. First, it chills the speech of organizations that may not have the sophistication or monetary resources, in one sense, to access traditional media, be that the timing of it or the expense of it, but also the sophistication of navigating campaign finance laws, navigating the disclosure requirements that groups have to follow. Depending on, you've got a state network of laws and regulations, you've got federal networks of laws and regulations, and this is not easy for the average person to understand. So not having the sophistication to know what's required through disclosure and what you have to file with the FEC can really chill the speech of those organizations, and really only ensures that large, sophisticated organizations with the expertise and the money are able to be the ones talking about politics. The other way that this chills speech is it chills speech when platforms refuse to publish political ads. And we've seen that in practice when you had Google and Facebook decided that instead of trying to follow the law and keep up with all of the issues, they were just going to stop showing political ads because the burden was just too great to try to follow it, all of the legal issues. You also chill speech when those platforms no longer publish the political ads and you have nowhere to go to really, you have no Facebook, no Google, and that chills the ability of people to use the online area, community, to get their political speech out and their political ads out. Also, another First Amendment concern is that disclosure requirements can compel speech. We saw this in Maryland, where the Washington Post sued over their disclosure requirements. The Washington Post argued that requiring political ads to have certain information, a lot of information being put up with every ad, is compelling the speech of the Washington Post, what they can print in their newspaper. It also can compel speech for individual organizations that may not want to put a paragraph up about the disclosure when they want to have an ad. So it's compelling speech, I think, both on the platforms and also the compelled speech on the part of the organizations that want to run these ads, telling them what they have to say. Finally, free association is threatened by stripping citizens of their privacy. We have seen this when regulations seek to find out the donors of the organization. So a group runs an ad, specifically an issue ad that's for education, be it on gun issue or healthcare issues, etc. And the regulation asks that they disclose every donor that's given to that organization. That threatens free association, and it threatens the ability of people to band together. With those concerns, there's a couple principles for legislation that I think are protect free speech, and at the same time striking that balance of disclosure and knowing what groups are paying for the ads and who is behind the political ads that people see. First, I think it's important to recognize that different media calls for different rules, and this is especially true when it comes to the internet. People are really familiar with television ads, the ominous voices, and the end, this ad is paid for by X, Y, and Z. The media, the internet is different. I think as Ron showed, you've got banner ads, you've got pop-up ads, you've got a lot of different avenues for these ads to be seen. It's also not a captive audience when you've got a banner ad that pops up on your screen, and it's not a television where you're watching an ad for 30 seconds and that's all that's on television. So I think different rules need to apply for the internet. Also, keep in mind kind of what Ron showed with that portal. The internet is a great way it's an easy medium for people when they have questions to just open a new web browser and search for whatever group is behind it or to learn more. I think people already do this when you see a story on Facebook or a tweet, and is that true, or I'd like more information, and it's really easy to open a new browser and find more information about that. The next principle is the law should be clear on what is required for compliance and what disclosures must include. This helps those smaller organizations with less sophistication, and it helps everybody that the law says this is what's required to comply with the law. This is what the disclosure must include. That's easy for people to follow. It's easy for platforms to follow as well. Along with that, disclosure should be concise, clear, and convey only needed information to the public. This is self-explanatory, but it's important also to inform the public. If there's a lot of words and a lot of disclosures that people don't understand, it doesn't help the public who are seeing these ads and need to learn about them. It should be concise, clear, and convey the information that the public needs to know. And finally, any legislation or regulation should not reduce the ability of individuals and nonprofits to engage in political speech. As I've outlined, political ads are political speech. At the heart of the First Amendment is the protection of political speech, to talk about government and speech about the government and government policies, and that's important to protect and to make sure that everybody has access and the ability to engage in that speech. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mandy for our next presenter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Now we're going to move on to our final speaker, Jared DeMarinis. Jared is the Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the Maryland State Board of Elections. He's one of the first people in the nation to draft and pass regulations regarding the use of social media, internet advertisements by campaign accounts, and political contributions by text message. Jared helped draft Maryland's Online Electioneering, Transparency, and Accountability Act, which requires that online platforms disclose publicly who paid for the digital campaign ad. And a note for our audience quickly, there's just the one slide for this part of our presentation, so don't worry if things don't move. Over to you now, Jared.
Thank you, Mandy. And I just wanted to say thank you for putting together this panel and this important topic for everyone here. And thank you for inviting me as well to be a panelist. Thomas Jefferson once said that a well-informed electorate is a prerequisite for democracy. And the only way to truly inform the electorate about who's influencing them and their votes is through disclosure. Political digital ads offer political committees many advantages over traditional sources of communications. First, you have micro-targeting of the audience and messages. Everything is so tailored now. Two, it's very cheap. And three, it's effective. The number of impressions received by an individual in one ad is far greater than any piece of mail received or a 30-second TV or radio ad. And how they use that word impressions, I think, is important because that's the effectiveness of it. It's something that it comes on your phone, as Ron and David just mentioned, or on your phone, on your watch, and you just scroll through it, and it's the same ads over and over again. And it's the eyes that you constantly see it, and that's why it makes an impression on you, and not, you don't have to necessarily click through to see it. So I think that's important for this landscape in which we're talking about here. Maryland, recognizing all the positive uses of digital ads early on, was one of the first nations to try to regulate its usage while still maintaining the disclosure requirements responsible for ads that we had on the books for TV and for mail pieces. We crafted initial regulations early on, balancing the platform limitations with the banner ads and space and size requirements. The political committee's needs, which is to use said ads space because of, like I said, the micro-targeting, the cheapness, and the effectiveness of them, but also the right to know for the general public about who's actually influencing their decision. And I think that's always key here too, that the voter has to have a right to know who's attempting to influence them and their votes. So with this was the backdrop for everything. Then came 2016. This election, out of all the elections, really showed the power of the digital communications and the spread of dis or misinformation and foreign interference. Online political advertising increased 8-fold from 2012 to 2016. It just showed how much of an influence it was. So with that all in the background here, Maryland passed the Online Electioneering Transparency Act, or House Bill 981, in the 2018 legislative session. Maryland was a targeted state in 2016 by the Russians with Facebook ads. So that was one of the backdrops for it. Additionally, when we were discussing this, the need to modernize and to, make sure and to look at the landscape, we had to update the law to reflect the current environment. Eyes are now on the internet and social media now more than ever, again, with the impressions. Most people are switching for news sources from traditional TV and radio to the internet. So those ads that are coming on there are becoming more and more important than ever before. So those impressions, even if you don't click on it, you're seeing it, and those ads are making impressions on you. This law was the first in the nation to tackle directly digital advertising. There was Seattle and Washington State had a law that was passed decades earlier, and it was read to apply to today's environment. This law was drafted specifically for the current environment. I believe we placed a video in the chat boxes there. It's a brief 3-minute video that we had done at the State Board of Elections here, just explaining how the law works. So check it out. It's a nice little thing there. The law itself is very simple. The online platforms must keep a public database of who and how much was spent on digital ads, and it's got to be updated within 48 hours of the purchase of an ad. The rationale is simple here. The voters are on the site, the voters get the ad there, it's one-stop shopping, basically. If you make a viewer go to a different site and leave wherever they're at or click to something else, in all likelihood, they're not. So we wanted to make sure that the viewer has all the information it needs at its fingertips immediately. So this gets the electorate, what Thomas Jefferson wants, to be informed. Additionally, one of the things I believe that the database would do is increase the political discourse. So I don't believe it would have a chilling effect on free speech. In fact, it would actually increase speech, because now with the database, campaigns would be able to go on there and see all the ads that are against them and who they're targeting and what they're saying. And it permits the opportunity for the campaigns then to dispel false information or offer just a response to that, to those voters. So instead of just in the dark shadows here of a targeted message, it shines light on everything here and allows all the participants in the political arena the ability to engage in the discourse here. The online platforms also must retain other records regarding the digital ad at the request of the State Board or other law enforcement agencies here if an investigation is occurring about said ad. The law strengthened authority line disclosure requirements, which was mentioned about, like, in Maryland we call them authority lines, but on the federal side it's the paid for. And it also had an enforcement provision here. And one of the keys to the enforcement provision is the removal of the digital ad from the platform. You can do civil penalties, and those would have some factor in making sure that political committees would comply. But if you're dealing with foreign actors and foreign principals, a fine of $1 million would not be a deterrent for noncompliance. The only action in that case would be the removal of the ad, because they're not going to ever want to comply. And we have to remember, in this case here, foreign actors have no First Amendment rights. So the idea that we're either tampering or trying to limit their speech or chill that speech is immaterial. So as it was mentioned, we did have some, there was a lawsuit that was occurred with the Washington Post. The press had some concerns about the platform and the database itself, saying that it was compelled speech. The Fourth Circuit issued a narrow ruling on this, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows that the law is still in effect for online platforms that are not media concerns. I think some of the focus of the ruling focused a little bit too much on whether this act could end Russian interference it could not, but especially in the unpaid arena, but it would stop them in the paid arena, and that was one of the elements that occurred in 2016. So it is there, and it's still in effect. Some of the other effects of the law was that Google announced that it was not accepting any political ads for the 2018 and the 2020 elections in the state of Maryland. But there are other factors that weigh into those decisions from Google as well. Market share, not necessarily their cries of poverty or that they don't have the technological capabilities to perform or to build such a database. For example, like Twitter in 2019 banned all political ads, all paid political ads on its platforms, just because it made financial sense for them. And on the flip side of all this here was that Facebook hailed the legislation as model legislation across the state. So I think this is, how it is, and that's why I was just like, you can't necessarily look at everything that is going on. I'm sorry. Hold on for a second. I'm sorry about that. One of the other things too, which is that everyone needs to worry about, is about the size and the scope differ about the size of what constitutes an online platform. In Maryland, we did 100,000 viewers. State elections by nature are smaller, and therefore, if you want to make a bigger impact, you would have to look at more regional or local sites, which would have a smaller viewership. So I think that if you go beyond that, you may run into the fact that you're still allowing for people to have impact on that. Now, one of the things that I feel is important to mention is that the law is filling a void that is left by an inaction at the federal level here. I think if more and more states are following Maryland's lead as well, because of the fact that there is a need for disclosure in this field, and the federal level is not going to act anytime soon. California passed similar disclosure requirements, New York as well. So I think as more states move into the scenario here, I believe that it's going to help push the ball forward for greater disclosure, and it would be important. So I think with that, I'll be happy to open up for any questions here. I think we have a little bit of time left here, and I'll give it back to Mandy.
Great. Thank you so much, Jared. We do have a few questions that have been submitted in the chat box, but if people have lingering questions on their minds, please feel free to add them in. And I think I will start with a question for you, Jared, which came from Nancy Morgan in the chat about cost. So a question about monitoring and enforcing the act. So how much investment was needed to allow the Maryland State Board of Elections to do effective enforcement of the new law? And I might add to that, how much does it cost to administer this law more generally?
Well, some of the stuff about the law was that it was pushed on the platforms of themselves to make sure that the platforms put on the database and to have their libraries of all the political ads, because of the cost aspect and the technical aspects to receive all those ads and JPEGs and to make sure that they would be updated in 48 hours. And I think that was one of the rationales behind making sure that the ones with the greatest expertise in this field were the ones that were responsible for the database. So then the cost for the state would be more of the investigative part of it, which is making sure that the online platforms are complying with the law, and that is done through some of the resources we currently have. So, as we always are, every state board of elections or every agency is always going to say that they're understaffed, but we always could use more staff. But we're adapting with current personnel in order to do this. And one of the things too is that the political landscape is also a self-regulated industry here. And when I say that, it means that political opponents are looking at their adversaries' reports, ads, and sites, so that they're the ones that are going to funnel complaints into the agency to look to see if they're complying, or if they're not complying, making sure that the complaints are investigated. So I think that's kind of the general state of it. So in order to limit the costs, some of this was pushed on the ad networks themselves and the online platforms.
Thank you. I also have a couple questions from the chat box for David. And first, actually, David, I thought I'd want to give you an opportunity to respond to Jared's presentation, since I know you're both coming at this issue from very different perspectives. So if you want to respond to that, please go ahead. And then I also wanted to ask you the question from Stan Ward in Maryland, if there are any specific disclosure requirements that you would support. David?
Thanks, Mandy. I don't have really any specific response to Jared's presentation, but I think it's important to remember that political ads are that core political speech. And, I think we need to not treat political ads as, as troublesome, as problematic. And I think the idea of outside interference, and he's absolutely right with the First Amendment, but in protecting, Americans from outside speech, when we don't use a scalpel, but we try to use a sledgehammer, what happens is you impact and you violate the speech rights of a lot of Americans who do have, First Amendment protection. So I think it's important to view political ads as speech that we should welcome, because it's important and it's protected by the First Amendment. As far as what disclosure requirements I do support, I think it depends on what you're talking about. Political campaigns, candidate ads have different disclosure requirements. I think whoever gives to candidates knows that they're going to be disclosed the amount of money, and that's a different realm. What I'm specifically concerned with about disclosure requirements is when you get into nonprofits who are not advocating for or against candidates, but it's issue advocacy, and they want to inform people about an important issue, and they don't have candidates that they're supporting or trying to defeat, which again brings different disclosure requirements. That's troublesome, specifically when people try to get at the names, addresses, phone numbers of people that have donated, be it $20 or $100 to those organizations. And we have seen examples on both sides of the political spectrum of people being targeted, of people facing consequences for their support of organizations. And even something as innocuous as, public funding of a sports arena in a city, people that may speak out against that can face consequences.
Thank you, David.
Mandy, can I respond to that for that?
Of course.
I was just going to, I think though, at one point there, even issue ads though, the people, they're trying to influence votes. And it's important that we still have disclosure regarding the ability of the influencers. And having knowledge of who's behind that speech is important, because then you can weigh the source of that speech appropriately. And knowing who donors are, they have specific agendas, and the individuals then, when going to the ballot box, can weigh all those factors. Limiting those speech limiting that disclosure is basically tantamounting to having people go into the ballot box blind and without all the necessary tools and resources to make an informed decision.
Thank you. I have a question for Ron. Is the DAA interested in developing voluntary standards for political ad databases, maybe a centralized database for the whole industry? And again, that came from the chat box.
Sure, thanks. I think it's something that the DAA has thought about for sure. I think it's technically more complicated than it sounds, and there are concerns about not only the content but also security issues. And what I mean by that is, how do you design a centralized database that lets the right people post the right ads that are required? You can imagine a scenario where someone, puts an ad in and claims it is an ad that their opponent ran. I mean, there are logistical hurdles there. I don't think I can rule it out, but I know that it's not easy, and it's also, Jared, I know you talked about sort of the, pushing the costs onto the platforms, but it's not cheap, and it's not easy. And while it may seem that one of the big tech companies could create something like this, there are legitimate challenges here. One point I'd like to make is that even the definition of online platform in Maryland, it does have 100,000 or more unique monthly U.S. visitors. But the way it's defined is that it's a public-facing website, web application, or digital application, including a social network, ad network, or search engine. So, even trying to understand in that, where on my diagram, online platform fits, there may be multiple entities that meet that definition. So it gets complicated real fast. So that's a very long answer to the specific question, but I think it's it helps to illustrate the complexities even of a voluntary database, and why there's certainly if enough interest is there, the DAA would certainly think about it, but it's not as easy as designing the icon, which in and of itself presents its own technical challenges.
Thank you, Ron. I think that helps illustrate what has been one of the biggest takeaways for me, which is that digital ads are more complicated than any other form of ad. And so that's something that we all need to keep in mind as we are, working with this issue, thinking about this issue. Unfortunately, we are not able to get to all of the questions in the chat box since I don't want to keep everyone over. But if you do have them, please email those questions. You can see all of our email addresses here on this final slide. And to wrap up, I also want to briefly mention a new resource from NCSL, which is a web page that provides an overview of different approaches, including legislative approaches for managing digital political ads, and it highlights significant legislation on the topic. So my colleague Christy has shared that in the audience chat box, and you can find it there. And I want to highlight these upcoming NCSL events. So on Thursday, there will be another campaign finance related webinar where money and free speech intersect. And then next week, another webinar, Lessons Learned from the 2020 Primaries. Later on this month, NCSL is hosting a 3-day event, Base Camp, which will feature several elections events, including political analysis of both the federal and state electoral scenes, and a presentation on elections, what to expect when the unexpected happens. And then later that week, you can find out what's going on with the census. So lastly, I want to extend a big final thank you to all of our presenters for sharing their time and expertise today, and a big thank you to our attendees for taking the time to join us. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be available on NCSL's website within a week. Thank you all, and I hope you have a nice day.